Welcome to this particular webinar on building the global circular economy. And we will be studying in particular the opportunities for Canada-EU leadership and collaboration. This event has been co-organized by the Institute for European Environmental Policy, of which I am a member, and of which Eline, who I'm going to present in a second, is also a member, the Canada, Mission of Canada to the EU, and the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra. With us today, we have a great selection of panelists, I would say, and I will introduce them all. We will all get to meet them in a second. Just before we get into that, a bit of logistic, if you allow me, just to mention that this event is recorded and will be eventually posted on the IEEP website. So that is how the session going to be organized. I would also like to mention that this particular event is a part of a series of events. As you know, that this has been part of a project that IEEP has been working on with Sitra to produce case studies on how EU trade relations with selected trade partners can foster circular economy principles around the world. And we've been looking at several trade relations between EU and partners. So today, we're looking at EU and Canada in particular. I wanted to flag that on Friday morning, there will be the same kind of events worked on between the EU and Nigeria opportunity. I believe that, Eline, if you could please share the link to that particular event, please do not hesitate to register for that event as well. Without further ado, I would like to pass on the floor to Malena Sell, who is a senior specialist on circular economy at the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra, for introductory remarks and to introduce the context of the project and the particular topic of that event. Malena, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Antoine. And good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are, to everybody. Glad to have you join this, what should be a very interesting discussion. And thanks in particular, of course, to the Mission of Canada and into the EU, as well as the IEEP. We'll be very pleased to be hearing from many experts that have been working on circular economy for a long time and on trade. And Canadian EU leadership is, of course, what we're here to, both leadership that's already taking place and how this could be speeded up. One example on the international level is the World Circular Economy Forum, which the Canadian government organized and hosted together with Sitra last fall. At the forum, there were a lot of different topics, but trade was also one of them. And that was an opportunity for companies to hear about how they can speed up their own internal transition towards circularity. The EU and Canada are also both members of the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency, which is another important global initiative. But somehow the trade path has been less explored up to now. And the EU-Canada Economic and Trade Agreement is actually quite strong when it comes to environment. And there's definitely potential also to strengthen the collaboration on circular economy. And as you'll be hearing, there are many interesting sectors here, such as the bioeconomy and also the raw materials sector, which all are critical when it comes to the green transition, as well as the digital transition that are happening hand in hand today. And in fact, the EU and Canada also have a strategic partnership on critical raw materials. Taking a step back, in this world situation that we have right now, all of our thoughts are, of course, with the people of the Ukraine, and the world has changed so much very rapidly. One thing that comes to fore is the importance of resilience and partnerships in this situation. Another thing that comes up also for Europe is that our sustainable energy transition must speed up, as our reliance on fossil fuels from Russia quickly has to just completely shift. And that's a big project, and it's targets that we're going towards anyway, but the speed really needs to be completely different now. And this has strong material impacts as well. And I already mentioned the strategic partnership between the EU and Canada when it comes to resilient, sustainable value chains of critical raw materials. In this context, part of that is on circular economy and resource efficiency, and this certainly is very important to keep in mind as we go ahead, and of course during discussions today. So wishing you a good webinar here, and over to you again. Thanks a lot, Antoine.
Thank you very much, Malena, and allow me to conclude with you to say that we think a lot about the people of Ukraine who indeed are living through such a terrible time at the moment. So without further ado for this particular event, I will pass on the floor quite directly to Eline, who is our policy analyst in the team of Global Challenges and SDGs at IEEP, who will have the chance to present the findings, the main findings and recommendations on the EU-Canada case study that we've been developing under this particular project. So, Eline, please, you have the floor.
Thanks, Antoine, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. I do hope you can see my screen. If Antoine, you could give a thumbs up if that's looking all right. Great. So yeah, my name is Elina Blot, and I'll be presenting IEEP's EU-Canada case study on trade in support of circular economy. I briefly want to give a quick overview of what I'm going to be touching on today. So first, I'm going to speak on the relevance of EU environmental policies and its potential spillovers in third countries. Then I'm going to talk about the EU and Canada's relations and trade framework. Then I'm going to briefly touch on circular economy opportunities in Canada. And then we're going to wrap up with some recommendations that are particularly focused on supporting dialogues between these countries and also globally. So first, under the Green Deal, the EU has launched several environmental policy initiatives that risk producing spillover effects through existing trade flows by establishing new requirements for goods sold on the EU market. The EU Circular Economy Action Plan is a package of policy initiatives aimed at transforming the EU's production and consumption patterns by, for example, setting new standards for electronics to be repairable, or by setting sustainability criteria for clothing sold in the EU market. Not only will this change the way that EU citizens buy and use goods, it will also change industry's demands for input materials, materials for production, since they now need to adhere to new criteria for circularity. On top of this circular economy package, the EU has also unveiled its plans to strengthen its compliance framework through two channels, first being through the new environmental and human rights due diligence and corporate social responsibility legislations, which will hold corporations accountable for human and labor rights violations, as well as failures to protect environment throughout their supply chains. The second channel for more compliance is through a more proactive stance to enforce trade rules in the EU's trade agreements. So this taken together, these policies under the circular economy package and the strengthened compliance framework, we see that there is an increased risk of trade barriers rising due to these new requirements such as standards and or certifications on imports, as well as market access restrictions for unsustainably sourced products. The relevance of this in the context of the EU-Canada relations is that enhanced cooperation and exchanges on the implications of these policies could limit the extent to which trade flows are hindered by these new regulations that will be implemented under the Circular Economy Action Plan. So Canada and the EU have a very long history of cooperation built on a foundation of shared values. This cooperation has intensified through the Strategic Partnership Agreement and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, the CETA, which have both applied provisionally since 2017. The SPA sets the framework for EU-Canada political relationship, and it also provides for regular dialogues on various areas, including climate change, whereas the CETA governs the economic relationship between the pair and has led to nearly full liberalization of trade across sectors. So these two frameworks, the SPA and the CETA, are basically frameworks for cooperation, and they highlight the opportunity for Canada and the EU to cooperate more closely on the circular economy transition. So this begs the question, where is CETA in terms of environment and circular economy? The CETA itself includes a dedicated chapter which houses environmental provisions and commitments made by the trade partners. That's called the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. So this chapter does contain specific provisions on sustainable management and trade of marine resources and forest resources, but it doesn't explicitly mention the circular economy. That's not necessarily a bad thing because circular economy is relatively new. And as we know, CETA has been negotiated for years ago. So it's been a very long time. But that basically does mean that the CETA does not include provisions in the agreement which would bind these trade partners to actively pursue the transition to a circular economy. So in this light, this case study sought out other avenues for cooperation to the shift to circularity, trying to see what was available in the current CETA framework. So one avenue for cooperation that we found was through the TSD chapter provisions on cooperation. Very straightforward. The TSD chapter provisions on cooperation basically state that the parties commit to cooperate on the trade and investment in environmental goods and services, which does make reference to circular economy principles such as energy efficiency, life cycle management, and extended producer responsibility. So we do see elements of circularity in the agreement. The TSD chapter also commits partners to cooperate on environment at the multilateral level. So at multilateral fora, such as the World Trade Organization, the OECD, and dialogues linked to multilateral environmental agreements. The TSD chapter also establishes so-called domestic advisory groups, which are groups made up of industry or business, labor and NGO representatives, and they are tasked with monitoring the implementation of the TSD chapter. So these meetings, both at the multilateral level and between the EU and Canadian DAGs, could begin to address the shift to circularity happening within the EU and what that could mean for Canada-EU trade. Lastly, I do want to mention in particular, the CETA agreement includes a chapter on bilateral dialogues, which covers specific dialogues related to forest products and critical materials, including metals, minerals, and biomass for industrial use. So these are dedicated spaces for dialogue to discuss these topics, and it's actually very relevant for making progress on the circular economy. In particular, the bilateral dialogue on critical materials has actually led to the establishment of the Canada-EU strategic partnership on critical materials, which looks to develop resilient supply chains, support innovation and circularity, and also strengthen domestic sourcing and processing of raw materials in the EU. So we've seen that frameworks within the CETA have been developed to actually support talks on circularity. So now that we've established the current state of EU-Canada trade framework and its available avenues for cooperation on circular economy, we can delve into how they are particularly relevant for certain Canadian sectors. So our case study assesses some key Canadian sectors that are represented in both bilateral trade, as well as being economically important for Canada. So Canada actually enjoys a wealth of natural resources, and as a result, in 2019, the mining of minerals and metals accounted for 3.2% of Canada's GDP, while forestry accounted for 1.2% of its GDP. So this case study analyzes these three sectors: the bioeconomy, the mining and minerals and metals mining sector, and the automobile sector, because we evaluated that they possessed a great potential for circularity throughout their supply chains. So from the minerals or materials extraction phase to the reprocessing of end-of-life products. However, for the sake of brevity, I will not go into each of these sectors, but a main takeaway from our case study is that we found that Canadian natural resources sectors actually already adhere to generally high environmental standards. However, it's not yet clear how the EU's circular economy package will affect product requirements and if all existing Canadian standards will be considered up to par. So this is a key question surrounding the implementation of the Circular Economy Action Plan for third countries, which brings me to our recommendations that we do hope will ease uncertainty surrounding this topic. Our case study develops some recommendations for both Canada and the EU to pursue together bilaterally under the CETA framework and also multilaterally to facilitate a common understanding of circular economy and what the circular transition could mean for international trade and environmental action. Moreover, these dialogues at bilateral and multilateral level will form an essential platform to discuss standards for circularity and how they can be mutually recognized and harmonized globally. So at the bilateral level, we would recommend that Canada and the EU provide sufficient resources to members of the dialogues that I mentioned previously. So these resources could actually mobilize extra efforts for additional discussions on circular economy by allowing members to organize more meetings as well as commission their own research work to delve more into the topic. We'd also recommend a greater involvement of stakeholders and experts in these meetings to enable in-depth discussions. Specifically, I mean, circular economy, it really does mean, people have different perspectives on it because it's quite new, it's complex, and depending on where you stand in the supply chain, it means different things. So it's really important to get actors together around the table. And this brings me to my final point on bilateral level, which is that Canada and the EU should encourage more knowledge exchanges on circular economy with their respective experts, as well as exchanges on monitoring frameworks and data collection methods, because this is actually a key gap that we identified, or a key challenge that we identified in our case study. At the multilateral level, as previously mentioned, CETA commits parties to cooperate at multilateral fora. We'd like to highlight specifically the WTO's trade and environmental sustainability structured dialogues and the informal dialogues, such as the one on plastics pollution and environmental sustainable plastics trade. So those are two existing fora that Canada and the EU could champion to discuss circular economy. We'd also recommend that Canada and the EU take forward their efforts at the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency. And then finally, something that we would really like to highlight is the expertise of the private sector as they form a valuable resource and a wealth of expertise and adaptability with an expert eye for process efficiencies. So it would be essential to begin to enable more public-private cooperations to support the development of circular economy frameworks and design and harmonization of standards for circularity. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I will hand over to Antoine.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eline, for this great presentation. I particularly like the idea that to present the idea of the impact that the Circular Economy Action Plan, the EU CEAP, can have on trade flow and the consequences on the EU trade partners, including, of course, Canada. Well, appreciating the fact that we mentioned that although the CETA doesn't specifically mention circular economy, as this is a new concept that you've said, it still allows for a great deal of cooperation for a shift towards circular economy. And of course, allows for cooperation in a multiple of sectors in which this could be extremely relevant. You've listed a few, and I encourage, of course, every participants to go and read the study for further details on those. Finally, obviously, the recommendations on further dialogue and cooperation, whether it's at the bilateral or the multilateral level, is absolutely key between the EU and Canada to foster this principle. So thank you again for highlighting this point and for your presentation. We will now move on to the next section of the event, which will be a set of presentation by a great set of panelists, as I've said in introduction, which will be followed by a question and answer session. By this stage, I would like to encourage the audience to use question and answer, the Q&A box, to post questions whether general question or question to a specific panelist. If that is the case, please name the panelist to whom your question is directed. And I will, of course, encourage on my side panelists to answer as many questions as possible. And I will take upon me to try and gather them and direct them as best as I can. Now, without further ado, I would like to go on to pass the floor to our set of panelists, and we start today with Mrs. Judith Gelbman. I hope I pronounced the name well, who is the counselor and head of section for agriculture, fisheries, and the environment at the mission of Canada to the EU. So, Judith, you have the floor.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So let me just start out by saying thank you to IEEP and Citra for this event today. I think we're really pleased to be co-hosting and pleased to be taking part. I think it's a great opportunity to highlight the importance of circular economy, to think about what that means in the Canadian and the European context. It's not always the same, but we share the same goals, and this is a good opportunity to think about how it is that we can work together to meet those goals. So I just want to start out by saying that. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you also for Malena for sharing the key findings of the case study. I think it's very important. It's very good to have that kind of expert look from a distance at what things that we can learn from circular economy. I mean, first of all, I think one thing that's clear is that Canada is a very important partner to the EU, and we have a lot of collaborative initiatives that we work through together. So I'll get into that. But I think, the most important thing I want to emphasize, or the message that I want to leave behind, is that, the partnership with Canada can help the EU meet their own goals under the Green Deal and the Circular Economy Action Plan. So that I think is the key thing to think about. I also agree that CETA is very important in contributing to those goals as well. So we can talk about that as well. So first of all, I just want to say, I think we all agree that through better design and use of resources, circular economy solutions can help us reduce waste, increase economic opportunities as we all transition to net zero economy. So that's, I think, the underlying theme. The Canadian governments recognize that fact very clearly, and we're working through various avenues in partnership with the EU and elsewhere as well. I think one of the things that comes out of the case study is the fact that we're working in different levels, at the federal level, at the provincial territorial level, municipal level. I think that's an important thing to think about, because that's the way, the Canadian Constitution sets out our jurisdictions, but that doesn't stop us from working together across country as a national approach. And what I think it does do is teach us how to work together collaboratively at the domestic level, and that's what we're doing. So we're actively working with our partners across the country and abroad on research and engagement opportunities to find those innovative solutions that we can work on. The case study points, for example, to ambitious action that's at the federal level, working with partners to eliminate plastic waste. We've got other priority sectors, as already mentioned: mining and minerals, forestry, food waste, government procurement, and in all these areas, Canada is a leader in convening domestic partners and also global partners to find solutions. So, as Malena had mentioned earlier, we are very happy to host the World Circular Economy Forum in September last year. Again, the convening role of bringing together business leaders, policymakers, civil society, to discuss the challenges that we're all facing, and then to think about what are the game-changing innovations that we could work on together. And as Alina pointed out, as in terms of a recommendation of bringing in that expert opinions, I think that's something that we're very good at. Of course, EU is a particularly valued partner. So again, we've talked about the CETA, we've talked about the SPA. I just want to flag, that last summer, Prime Minister Trudeau met with his EU counterparts, Commission President von der Leyen and Council President Charles Michel. And they also talked about the opportunities to leverage these partnerships to create those opportunities, including for circular economy. In that summit statement, which is available online, they made an explicit commitment to step up cooperation on circular economy and efficient use of natural resources. And stemming from that, and there's been several mentions of this already, is the Canada-EU Strategic Partnership on Raw Materials, which is one of the initiatives coming out of the summit. Very, very important initiative. What it aims to do is seek to diversify sources of green economic inputs and to ensure secure and reliable and sustainable supply chains. So that's the impetus behind it. And it's going to be a very important partnership that we're going to be ramping up in the near future. So, I think the question I was asked to prepare for coming here is, what are the different Canada-EU collaborative partnerships that we have? So I just have to say there's too many to list. I have a long list here. I won't go through it. There's not enough time. But there's a couple of things that already got mentioned as well. The Global Alliance for Circular Economy Resource Efficiency, Canada was very happy to join that last year as well. So we're working closely with the EU there. Something I don't think that came out too strongly is the work that we're doing on plastics. So Canada we launched, I guess, the Ocean Plastic Charter during our G7 presidency in 2018. And that's something where the EU has been an active partner with us. Just now, earlier this month, on the margins of the UN Environment Assembly, we all worked together to launch the negotiation of a new global agreement on plastic pollutions. So something that we put a huge priority on, and we're very pleased to have played a partnership role there, and we're pleased to be working with the EU on that as well. On the trade side, yes, I think it's been mentioned that CETA doesn't explicitly mention circular economy, but I think the thing to take away from that conversation about CETA is that the Canada-EU trade relationship writ large is governed by a strong commitment to environmental stewardship and sustainable development more broadly. And so working to advance circular economy goals is implicit in that joint commission. So I just because it's not called circular economy, I mean, what that concept is maybe a little bit fuzzy, but that commitment to transition to zero carbon future, to look for opportunities to reduce emissions, address climate change, that's all there. And we're doing lots of things there as well. So, there's several committees. Again, there's 20 committees, there's dialogues under the SPA. I won't list them all, but some of the things the events as well, the CETA Tech Workshop we've been doing since 2018, there's been several of those. We're bringing together stakeholders from all corners, exchanging information and best practices, and advancing innovative thinking. So all that is taking place in that CETA context. And the thing that CETA does for us, where other trading partners don't maybe have the same advantage with the EU, is it gives us that forum to meet on a regular basis and talk about our ideas, talk about initiatives and opportunities. So yeah, and then I guess just a couple of things to point out as well, because we talked in the presentation a little bit about developing standards at the international level. That's very important. Canada and the EU are actively engaging in international fora there, and of course we very much are working together in the WTO through the TESDI, informal dialogue on plastic pollutions and sustainable trade. So there's absolutely tons of opportunities, tons of efforts. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg, and we'll be continuing to collaborate more and more. So I'm looking forward to hearing what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. for this reminders and outlining the many ways of collaboration that currently exist between the EU and Canada on how to foster, especially on how to foster circular economy and how generally to build a sustainable value chain. I will now pass on the floor to our next panelist, Mr. Andrew Murphy, who's a senior expert in regional and bilateral environmental cooperation at the DG Environment of the European Commission. Andrew, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. So, in fact, when I was preparing for this, you asked me to give a brief kind of overview of where we stand with our EU Circular Economy Action Plan. And I'll maybe start off by doing that, and perhaps start off by recalling that the Circular Economy Action Plan is an action plan of some 35 actions, but it's actually the second one. We had one under the previous commission that addressed issues such as plastics, and this one is really turning its attentions to the things which we didn't catch first time around. And I underline that it's one of the outputs and deliverables of the European Green Deal. Why do I do that? It's because the European Green Deal is a Commission priority. In other words, it's supported from the top. So this means it's not simply an environmental initiative, it's actually a growth strategy for Europe. And because it's supported from the top, it then permeates down through all the different DGs and parts of the Commission and ministries in the member states. So it goes beyond the confines of a simple environmental initiative. As I don't have a lot of time, I'll try to be fairly brief, but there are a number of things which are either just come along or just coming along, which I think of significant, what we would call deliverables under the Circular Economy Action Plan. So at the end of last year, there were two in particular I would mention. The first is a recommendation from the Commission on our environmental footprint methodology. And this is a transparent way of providing consumers and in fact manufacturers as well with information on the environmental footprint of the products that are being produced and the products that are being used. We also in November issued modifications to the EU shipments regulation. This governs shipments within the EU, but it also governs shipments which go from the EU out to third countries, so there'll be more control on that. And also a clampdown, if you like, on some of the more fraudulent activities. So there were two pieces of legislation initiatives that came out of the Commission at the end of last year. At the end of this month, so in other words, in a week's time, we're going to have another fairly significant output from the Circular Economy Action Plan. And that's the thing that we call our Initiative on Sustainable Products. It has been talked about as the Sustainable Products Initiative for many from the beginning, but it's recently changed. It's now the Initiative on Sustainable Products. And this has a number of components which are of interest. One is the proposal to empower green consumers, if you like, to put better control under the claims that are made for products. So at the point of sale, the consumer will have a clearer and more transparent and more objective idea of what he or she is buying, with a number of protection measures in there, such as the right to repair, and that proposal to make sure that companies really substantiate their green claims. There will also be an expansion of what we call our eco-design directive, because basically, if you think about the entire life cycle of a product, from the moment you begin to conceive it, you can actually design out a lot of the problems that come later down the line, such as waste. And the eco-design directive was focused very much on electrical goods, and we're now going to expand this out to cover a number of key value chains which were not covered by that. So that's a very significant output, I think, and it's coming along in the next week or so. Another one to mention will be the strategy on sustainable and circular textiles. Textiles are now becoming very problematic in terms of the waste that they produce. Again, a lot of I think I saw an estimate somewhere that 60% of the textiles that are thrown away are very often thrown away because of a fault in the quality, or the zip is broken, the buttons have popped or whatever. So there will be a strategy to really try to address these weak points. And also, for example, to consider not preventing the use of chemicals, which then subsequently prevent recycling. So there will be a whole sort of strategy which will be out on that, and that will be coming shortly. I realize I'm now running very much out of time. I'm 3 or 4 minutes in. So the second thing you asked me to look at, and I think that it's largely been covered in the previous presentation, was the international aspects of our collaboration on circular economy with Canada. And the two that were mentioned there that, again, I would maybe just like to repeat, was Canada was very, very supportive of the launch of the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency. They were one of the 10 countries that came on board from the beginning. The Commission helped to launch that. Now that it's up and running, we kind of I wouldn't say step back, but UNIDO and UNEP now take over the day-to-day running of the thing. But that is a very good example of where the EU and Canada work together to get something off the ground. The other one, which again was mentioned previously, was earlier this month, the global, or the launch of negotiations for a global plastics agreement. I mean, the EU and Canada stood side by side, and they are basically two stakeholders or parties of size. They make a difference, and they certainly help to, I think, to move this thing along. So that was very, very positive. Then just on a final point, we've been talking a lot about the dialogue, the formal relationship between the EU and Canada, which is made up of a cooperation agreement and CETA. The cooperation agreement, we have regular dialogue with our counterparts in Environment Canada, and circular economy is one of the joint priorities. The fact that, as the colleague from Canada said earlier, it was mentioned in the summit, this means it's also supported from the top. And we're very much into sharing our experience through dialogue with the colleagues in Environment Canada. CETA, the discussions we have there, very often they can be on the same issues. So, for example, we recently discussed in the CETA context the environmental footprint methodology. We've also had discussions on the revisions that are coming along to the packaging and packaging waste, because they have obvious trade implications. But there we talk to a different audience. It's not necessarily our colleagues from Environment Canada, but the colleagues that will be dealing with whatever particular aspect of the trade agreement is being dealt with in the committee. And we've covered not just the trade in goods and services that you mentioned in your report, but we also had a discussion recently, for example, in the Wine and Spirits Committee, because wine and spirits, packaging, environmental footprint, these are important issues in that setting. There was also a question came up on the chat I saw about the fact that the TSD chapter doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily contraignant or binding. It's a much looser arrangement. There is a review of the trade agreements across the board, which is taking place with an eye on beefing up some of the trade and sustainable development aspects. But I would say in the case, generally you get things to be discussed there, which are either exchanges of information on where we're going, discussions on problems that have been identified, or discussions on problems that have been raised from the civil society side of things. And I would say that up to now with Canada, there have not been major problems that we've come across. The civil society discussion has not necessarily brought forward major problems with the agreement. That doesn't mean that won't happen in the future, whereas in other countries it's not necessarily the same. But there is a review which is going on, and we will be waiting to see what our trade colleagues come up with. And on that point, I'll stop because I think I've just about used my 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Andrew, including for being mindful of the time. Thank you for your quick outline about where we are with the CEAP, and in particular with the upcoming publication of the Sustainable Product Initiative, which will be a very, very important milestone, of course, in that particular process. And there's a lot of work on that particular front. So good luck with that. May I take a second to ask Judith on one side and Andrew on the other. In the chat, we have someone who's asking, who's obviously from a Canadian organization working on circular economy, and who's been asking on the Canadian side and on the EU side how to get some more information to the presentations that were made, and how to get involved in the network of organizations working on circular economy. So if I could encourage both of you to perhaps type some answers as to where this particular type of information could be found, that would be great. Without further ado, let me pass on to the next panelist, Mr. Geoffrey McCarney, who's a professor of environment and development at the University of Ottawa and a senior research director at the Smart Prosperity Institute. And with Geoffrey, we were hoping to discuss with the demand for clean technologies increasing, what key circular opportunities would you identify for Canada to become a leader in the sustainable sourcing of natural resources? Thank you so much in advance, and I give you the floor.
Thank you, Antoine. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to join this discussion. For those of you unfamiliar with us, just quickly, Smart Prosperity Institute, we are Canada's largest environment economy research network and think tank, and we're based at the University of Ottawa. We work with academics, governments, civil society, and the private sector right across Canada internationally. on issues like the circular economy and greener economy transition more generally. I read the report from IEEP with interest, and just in the limited time I have, I wanted to pick up and push on three aspects of this in relation to the question on sourcing of natural resources, and then a little bit more generally. The first thing I wanted to highlight is the report points out that Canada doesn't have a national circular economy strategy right now, and highlights the potential for Canada-EU collaboration to encourage that kind of development in Canada. And while that's true, if we're specifically thinking about the natural resources sectors, but also other sectors, I think it's important to realize that there are a range of Canadian initiatives that are linking federal, provincial governments and multi-sector stakeholders around either explicit CE language, circular economy language, or circular economy ideas like have been referenced earlier. These include things like the Canadian Metals and Minerals Plan, which references circular economy, the Green Mining Initiative, the Forest Bioeconomy Framework for Canada, which is leading to a range of investment in bioeconomy solutions here. Those particularly are relevant to the natural resources sector. And like I said, they recognize the multi-jurisdictional challenges we have in Canada, linking the federal government jurisdiction with provincial jurisdiction over resources, as well as waste streams. Outside of the resource sectors, there's things like the Canada-wide strategy on zero plastic waste. And if you want to understand where Canada is going and where opportunities might be, it's important to understand these more sector-based strategies and where we're focusing. Specifically to the natural resources sector, I want to pick up on this. It's something we've been thinking about a lot at the Smart Prosperity Institute, working with a range of our partners in government and the private sector. It's a broad area of work for us, and I appreciate the focus that the report from IEEP lends to Canada as a resource producer, and that it mentions a range of the innovative business solutions to advancing circularity in resource extraction. However, something we're trying to advance, I want to push here, is I'd like to move beyond the idea of circular economy and resource sectors just being about more sustainable extraction and the recyclability of critical metals. I think most of our work on this and work with our partners is suggesting a broader supply chain focus is needed. I'm going to touch on 2 points here, but if you want a more in-depth discussion of this, we held 2 sessions at the World Circular Economy Forum in the fall that are still online about thinking about supply chain issues in resource sectors. But the broad outline of those is that it really means something different for a resource company to explore circular solutions, which I think is highlighted in this report, right, and how we can reduce the impact of mining and metal extraction activity, for instance, versus understanding more broadly what a global circular economy would mean for resource producing economies like Canada, and what this means for trade relations and how trade relations between economies such as Canada's, which is a resource producer, and the EU, which is a resource importer, how they can create more circular solutions. Very briefly, there are a number of reports from organizations more prominent than ours, the OECD, the World UN Environment, the World Bank, which highlight that at least in the near to medium term, shifting to a circular economy requires both primary and secondary solutions. Global material demand is projected to at least double. This is from the OECD and UN Environment. That's despite ambitious assumptions about resource efficiency improvements. On top of that, the World Bank and others highlight that transitioning to a low carbon economy is going to be really material intensive. 400 to 500% increase in battery metal demand, 100 to 300% increase for critical metals for wind storage, for wind, solar, or storage technology, significant absolute growth in critical metal or in more metals like aluminum, copper, and iron ore. And even assuming 100% recycling of major metals, which is unrealistic in the near term, we still need growing demand for both primary and secondary materials to meet that demand. So we really need to think about how the incentives we're creating and the trade solutions that we're advocating advocate for both sustainable solutions to integrate primary and secondary materials. So this requires us to adopt solutions that will encourage the competitiveness of more sustainably sourced primary materials and where they fit alongside secondary material use. This includes things like not just examining where improvements in upstream mineral extraction and how sustainable solutions will meet Circular Economy Action Plan standards in Europe, but thinking about how we improve transparency and traceability along material supply chains to ensure that more sustainably extracted materials are those that remain more competitive in a more circular global economy. That includes both for primary use, in initial manufacturing, but also for recovery, secondary use as well, right? We want the materials that are continuing to flow through our economy to be those that were most sustainably sourced originally. We also need to think about new international collaborations to ensure extraction upstream is linked to innovation in material selection and product design downstream, so that we're thinking about developing improved recycling and recovery for the materials that are likely to grow in a circular economy, and we're orienting downstream businesses to more sustainably sourced materials upstream. To help with that, we also need to think about collaboration around better data and data sharing to both improve modeling of circular economy outcomes, understanding which materials will be required and which we need to extract and which can be left in the ground, and also understanding the environmental and climate impacts of different sources of primary, but also secondary material, because we're going to have to make trade-offs between the footprints of secondary materials, have environmental footprints as well, and we need to understand how they trade off with primary material extraction. And the last thing is we need regulations that are flexible to new circular products and technologies and allowing innovative use of secondary materials while adhering to the intention of international standards for things like trade and hazardous waste under Basel. And we need to think broadly about these ideas, and it relates more than just how we're extracting materials upstream and where the natural resource sector fits into these solutions. I think there's lots of innovative ways Canada and the UK can collaborate on that, given the focus both countries have on circular economy. But the last thing I want to make just in the last minute or so I have remaining is I also want to make sure we take a broader view of the relationship between Canada and the EU than just as Canada as a resource extracting economy. We also have a range of companies that are producing circular economy technologies and circular economy services. Smart Prosperity Institute has been working with Global Affairs Canada Trade Commission Service over the past several months, developing a list of over 70 Canadian companies that are advancing CE circular economy solutions for export. These include companies in some of the sectors you highlight, including metals and minerals and bioeconomy, but also leveraging Canadian expertise in petrochemicals for chemical recycling of plastics. These are currently being exported to the EU or being leased to EU manufacturing facilities, as well as high-tech solutions being developed by Canadian companies for things like material sorting for recycling, applications of AI. I noted it was interesting in the New York Times this week, they highlighted that Toronto is one of the fastest growing locations for the high-tech sector, ahead of more recognized cities like Austin. So I think while it's important to think about the role of the natural resources sector, I wouldn't want to lose focus of the broader range of circular economy solutions that Canada is developing and how that could support new collaborations between Canada and the EU. So I think I'm at time and I'll stop there, but I'm happy to pick on any of these topics further as we go forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Geoffrey, for this very interesting presentation and the brief outline that you gave us and the innovative business solution that exists in the sector of sustainable resources in general, whether that from a production perspective in Canada or from an import or consumption perspective in the EU. And thank you especially on this outline of the incentives of the trade solutions that could be needed for whether it's on more sustainable primary resources or more with examples such as transparency issues or the secondary materials. So thank you very much for that. I would like now to give the floor to our last panelist already, who is Mr. Jocelyn Blériot, Executive Lead in International Institutions and Governments at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And we wanted to ask you specifically, if you don't mind, that based on your research, what is the main challenge to the establishment of global circular value chains, and how can closer cooperation, which we've talked about a lot in this event, how can closer cooperation with trade partners such as Canada and the EU and to address this particular challenge? You have the floor.
Thank you, Antoine, and thank you for the panelists that's preceded me, who made a series of really excellent points, which I'll try not to repeat. I guess the question is very broad, and it goes beyond the simple EU-Canada cooperation, which I'll go to in a minute. I think one of the first and probably the biggest barrier is the fact that modern value chains, which are based on throughput and linear economy, have been optimized for linearity and efficiency. So even though circular economy is very much in favor at the moment and is being pitched as the solution, I think it's important to look that it's not as simple as simply deciding between two pathways. We have the choice to go either linear or circular, and the two are simply a question of deciding. because the current model, of course, is deeply ingrained, it's integrated, and it's favored by the economy's cost and incentive structure. And it's also important, I think, to try and consider that there are both technical and political barriers to the establishing of these global value chains at scale. First of all, politically, it's not always very easy to go beyond seeing the circular economy as a waste management strategy. And there's here a definite definition question. There is a system shift agenda that has to be taken into account. We've seen that the circular economy is both an overarching system change agenda, but also pitched as a solution to specific issues. And that's very clear when it comes to the plastics debate. We see circular economy pop up as a potential way forward in the context of a UN sanctioned treaty on plastic pollution. And interestingly, the ministerial declaration that was put together in September as a premise to that UNEA 5 decision didn't mention circularity, but it did pitch linearity as the main root cause of the problem that we're facing right now. So we're going at this through two different angles. One is the system change, one is the actual solution. So understanding what circular economy actually is, as a system shift, a transformation of production and consumption models, basically the heart of SDG 12. This is also, it's both political and technical in the sense that it needs a definition, and it links to what Judith was saying. A lot of the solution put together at the moment and considered are not called circular economy, but yet they are conducive to it. So maybe putting the right term on the right solution would also help consider that we don't overlook some progress that is being made simply because it's not called circular economy. And also, of course, if we take a global perspective, well, if everyone needs to be on board, it's important to be realistic and to help the transition of countries that rely heavily on providing virgin raw materials. There have been really interesting ideas floated, like the notion of exporting countries becoming managers of resources as opposed to outright sellers of resources. You know, this begs a lot of questions in terms of responsibility, ownership, accounting, et cetera, and it's a really devilishly complex one, but there is a way forward potentially by opening that kind of discussion. Maybe selling natural resources and stripping off the assets for short-term profit might not be the only solution. On the technical side, of course, there are traceability questions, there are product information questions. These could be addressed by implementing product passport type of schemes, embedded product information to make sure that we know what's in the product, how it's made, how it can be repurposed, et cetera, et cetera. There are variations in definitions, regulations, standards when it comes to secondary raw materials, as noted by the IEEP for a long time, but you know, most of the preceding speakers have alluded to that, and it really is an important one. We also have the product complexity and design that prevents refurbishment, repurposing of components in many, many cases, and also multiple transfers of ownership, which means that there's a loss of control at the point of sale. Data is absolutely critical in those global value chains if we want to circularize them, which also, by the way, of course, involves some investment in reverse logistics, which is not a minor thing to solve. Now, of course, if we look at the potential, and specifically here, I'd like to go back to the EU-Canada relationship, and having had the chance of being close to the Canadian circular economy ecosystem for a few years now, there really is a strong and growing CE ecosystem in Canada, notably at provincial and municipal level. I'll just mention as an example, the CERIEC, which is a research center with the School of Technology in Quebec University, the Quebec Circular Economy Platform, several initiatives by the City of Toronto, and the recent report that was commissioned by Environmental and Climate Change Canada to the Canadian Council of Academies, on which we had the pleasure to serve as an advisor, along with a few colleagues, notably the people from the Smart Prosperity Institute, so colleagues of the speaker that just preceded me. There are points of collaboration on circular economy that can be easily identified, and as it's been noted, despite the fact that CETA does not explicitly mention it, there are resources within the agreement that definitely enable closer cooperation in this space. It's also a question of looking at it precisely and saying, this is not called circular economy, but actually this is where it leads. So that also means that we need to look at the desired outcome, desired upstream outcome. Is there something that both parties are trying to achieve in their own value chain and at home, upstream, that could be favored? For instance, if we think about biomass or natural products, which criteria could be put in place so that the production of these actually have a positive impact in the country of production? Through a trade agreement, you could imagine that one value chain at home on the producing side could be made better, more resilient, more biodiversity friendly, simply because the criteria to export are better designed. And there are climate implications too. Important to highlight where circular economy contributes to climate ambitions, which both partners take very seriously. I'll just remind us that 45% of global GHG emission come from the way we produce and we use the stuff that's in the economy, including the food. So if we highlight where circular economy can make a difference, it's a win-win because we also contribute to those climate ambitions. So I'll stop here. It was a bit of a download, but I think that there are barriers that can be addressed. It's also a global context. So certainly the fact that Canada and the EU are very active in the Global Alliance for Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency, which is gaining strength and gaining a voice, is also really important. So setting the scene, being very practical about what can be advanced and what are the barriers, keeping that dialogue alive between two partners which have a leading voice on the international stage is absolutely critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation that highlights a few key issues surrounding circular economy, vocabulary being one of them. Everything around definition, what is circular economy? It touches upon every single stage of the value chain, essentially. And that is also why we've developed several case studies, for instance, because the reality of circular economy principles and actions will be very different whether we look at EU-Canada, for instance, which will have a lot of upstream issues, but with product design and the like. And when we look, for instance, the next event and the next case study that I promote here, sorry about that, we're looking at Nigeria, where, of course, waste management, plastic will be much more upfront of the issue. And thank you as well for the link to the climate ambition, which is something that we should always keep in mind when talking about circular economy. That is one of the underlying objectives of this particular shift, of this particular transformation. So it's always good, I think, to remember. We're running out of time, unfortunately. So I wanted to have a very quick question that was just asked, and I found very interesting by someone in the audience on product initiatives and supply chain, about the role of digital tools like blockchain or digitalization in general. How digitalization and circular economy could work side by side, or how they could interact. I wanted to ask perhaps if Geoffrey would have something to say on the matter.
I apologize. I was just trying to respond in the chat. Could you repeat the question?
We've had a question on the role of digital tools like blockchain or in general digitalization in general when it comes to circular economy. As we're talking about clean technologies and the like, I wonder if you had some remark on the particular aspects.
Yeah, so two very quick thoughts, recognizing the time. One, I know there's a lot of there's specific initiatives out there that are looking at how you can better trace materials through the supply chain, not just from source to initial OEM, but further on through recovery through the waste stream, second, recycling or reuse, recovery, and on to the extent that we have infinite recovered materials. We want to understand where those materials are in the system. Blockchain or solutions like that can help us with that tracking and traceability of materials so that we can understand their overall footprint all the way along the supply chain, right from initial extraction all the way through to second, third, fourth use and eventual discarding. The second thing is there's a lot of interest we're seeing from different organizations and companies developing their own tracing and transparency systems, both in the mining sector. Anglo American and Rio Tinto come to mind, who have spoken about this at some of our events. And we also see demand for that sort of thing downstream with organizations like Ford and Microsoft joining the Institute for Responsible Mining Assurances, looking for assurance that the materials they're using are sustainably produced. And blockchain solutions can help meet those kind of demands to lead to more sustainably produced products. So just two initial reflections, if that helps.
Thank you so much for this answer. We are unfortunately running out of time, so the Q&A session will have to be a bit more. It was a bit shorter than expected. Now I'm afraid it's time to wrap up. I would like to extend my huge thanks to all the panelists who agreed to be with us today. As we've discussed, circular economy is a huge concept generally that involves a lot of potential areas for collaboration and areas for research work. And we've tried to touch upon the one that will be most relevant for the EU-Canada cooperation. And as we've seen, there are a lot. So, participants, I hope that you found this session interesting, insightful. And now I would like to conclude by mentioning again, with my apologies, the next event of that particular series of case studies that IEEP is presenting. We will be looking at the trade relationship between the EU and Nigeria. This will happen on Friday morning. The link is in the chat. Please do not hesitate to register. We will be looking at, of course, a very different aspect of circular economy. Thank you so much for attending this particular session, and I wish you a very nice end of rest of the day if you're in Canada, or a very good evening if you're in the EU. Thank you so much.